One of the big questions, and I know it's been already been discussed following the tweets, is the question of how the internet particularly potentially gives an alternative, gives an avenue of attack, an avenue of replacement. But the whole question of who controls the internet and how they control it is going to be a big one for everyone, particularly radical media. So I'll pass it to Gary to give you an idea of some of the issues.
Okay, I've got a very heavy weight on my shoulders. I've got to help.
Jacket on.
I've evidently got to help everybody out of the jam they're in with the media. Difficult, isn't it? I mean, the real problem here, I suppose, is that the internet is a global medium, and all our regulatory mechanisms, and almost all of them, are national in scope. So that's a summary of where we're at. Difficult to regulate a global medium when you're dependent on national mechanisms. And the issue of net neutrality, therefore, it sounds very technical, and I will spend hopefully not very much time, but a little bit of time trying to tease that out. It's quite important because it's a way into the potential possibility of global regulation. I recall going back about 10 years ago, there was a bit of a spat between the United Nations and the World Trade Organization as to who was actually going to regulate the internet. It came to nothing. The United Nations called a thing called the World Summit, very, very pompous sounding operation called the World Summit for the Information Society, which ended up with 2 conferences in Geneva and Tunis in 2003 and 2005. Bit of a fart in the wind in the end. But nonetheless, the issue is clearly, in the air, and the issue of regulation in a global environment is in the air, and it needs to be addressed, really. Okay, so the internet is traditionally, the other part of the problem is the internet is traditionally what's been described as an open medium. That's to say, anybody can access it, and the cost of the cost of entry is very low. Potential for your audience is global, so you've got a reach that spreads across the world, and you've got a very, very easy way into publishing on it, and so it's kind of that leads people to talk about it as an open medium, although in fact there's a kind of technological justification for that, underlying technological justification. But of course, this very openness is what makes it possible for organisations as diverse as Indie Media and Red Watch both to publish on the internet. So the issue today, following this spat in the early part of this century between the World Trade Organization and the United Nations, the issue today has really been reformulated in terms of the explosive growth of data on the internet. So technically, it seems to have become a technical issue. YouTube video iPlayers, all this huge amounts of data that are being sent across the network. It's actually causing or potentially causing a problem in terms of the capacity of the networks to handle it. And also, who's going to pay for it? And in recent months, the debate has fallen into, or the people has divided into 2 camps. Really, I'm speaking very broadly, but broadly speaking, it's fallen into 2 camps. One camp is the content providers, who are broadly speaking in favour of this thing called net neutrality, and the other is the network operators, people who own and control the wires and fibre optics that run through the ground. And their justifications for their positions are fairly simple. content providers want to see an open, an uncontrolled, and unregulated internet because they want access to the audiences, they want access to the wires, they want access to the income streams that can be generated from it. Network providers, network operators are against network neutrality because they see it as a way of, well, for two essential reasons. One is that they see it as an open invitation to their competitors to actually access their infrastructure and make profit from their infrastructure and therefore challenge them. And that's particularly relevant to what's called the local loop, the bit of the networks that actually goes to your homes or your offices. And the other reason they're against network neutrality is that they see it as a way of the thin end of a wedge which will force them to upgrade their networks to high bandwidth optical fiber. That's the technical bit done with, which will cost them an awful lot of money, and will also mean that they have to kiss goodbye to the cash cow copper fiber, copper wire, which is currently the way that most communications proceed, which of course has paid for itself many, many times over the years already. It's a cash cow, it just generates money. And if they have to upgrade, then the copper has to go, fiber optics have to be put in, and all the rest of it. Could be very expensive. So, broadly speaking, there are the two camps, content providers and the network operators, and they're opposed to each other. The question is, ultimately, do we actually need to regulate? I mean, the common view, I think, amongst the most users of the internet and most people who believe in media freedom and all the rest of it is that is for net neutrality, is that you don't regulate. There are, as it were, practical problems there because, as I say, you've got this conflict between the two people. You've also got a conflict you've got issues which arise out of the need to finance the network itself, and whether or not you're going to be able to force network operators, which is the European position at the moment, largely speaking, to force the network operators to actually finance the upgrades and all the rest of it, to get them to pay for it. You've got political issues which are huge and very significant in terms of the debates that are going on. So that, for example, recently, the last couple of weeks, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, released its final rules on what it calls the protection of the open internet, I think the title of the document is. And within days of them issuing these rules, a major network operator in the US called Verizon launched an appeal against them on the grounds that the federal organisation should not be allowed to dictate to commercial companies what they should and shouldn't do. And that kind of argument has been going on in the States for a long, long time. In this country, a few months back, we had the minister responsible for this area, Ed Vasey, making a speech in which he gave wholehearted support to the network operators. It was actually rather insipid support, but he basically came down in favour of the network operators. In other words, no network neutrality. Leave it to the network operators to do what they want. On the grounds which have been rehearsed over the years by people who have a vested interest in telecommunications infrastructure, that competition and light touch regulation, quote unquote, are what's necessary to keep everything going around nicely. I mean, the fact of the matter is that this is based on a complete misapprehension of the way the system actually operates. That there is a free market, there is such a thing as a free market, and in Europe this is a particularly egregious error. In Europe, the market in telecommunications is almost 100% dominated I think it's 4 operators, the remnants of the national champion operators, BT in this country, Telefonica in Spain, Deutsche Telekom in Germany, and France Telecom in France. And they have a nice little cozy cartel by which they operate, you know, their data exchange, their roaming charges, their you know, network management systems, and so on and so forth. And they don't want that interfered with. They don't want any kind of change to that. They don't want a continent-wide, or indeed a global system, or anything which would be supervening regulation of their arrangements. So the notion that there exists a market and there exists the possibility of competition is false. So the upshot is really that we have a conflict going on, expressed in various different ways in different countries and different parts of the world, about the issue of whether or not the network should be regulated. I mean, it sounds, as I say, technical, but in fact, when you start to analyse it, it's not just technical. What it means is that the technical aspects of the system open up issues to do with things like whether we're going to have access to high quality video, whether we're going to have access to, to decent digital radio, all the rest of it. That we do need to talk about. We need to make it very explicit that what we are talking about is regulation, and that regulation needs to be talked about and considered in terms of our overarching goals for this medium. Whether in fact we're talking about profit and market dominance, or whether we're talking about the old, I'm afraid, old issues of universal service provision, universal access, which used to control the way we talk about our media, and no longer. So, thank you.
I realise I didn't introduce myself at the beginning, so I'll do that now. Donnacha Talung, NUJ President. And just to wrap up, the point I made at the beginning is that the question of regulation will often seem anathema to radical media. The question of talking to government and asking for anything from government will often seem anathema. And the reality is, if you look back at the situation before the media in this country was deregulated, we had newspapers like the Daily Record. The Mirror was a proper newspaper. What's happened since is, with deregulation of print media, you've had a massive concentration of ownership. Same thing with the telecoms. With deregulation, you have massive competition, because the reality we face, much as we want to present an alternative, is a conflict between the state as being in some way answerable to the people, or ruthless capitalism, Murdoch. And Murdoch is what happened with deregulation. Not the free media that he promised when he was going to Wapping with the flowering of 1,000 blooms. Didn't happen. Because what we have is not just concentration of media ownership, but concentration of distribution, and the question of net neutrality, as Gary said, right at the core, is a question of of multinational corporations that own the pipes that comes through, wanting to control those and effectively charge as much as possible to the people who can pay and cut off the people who can't. So this is where we're at. The bigger issue, and I think the fundamental question, is also how what we can do, what we should be demanding. Because actually, talking about regulation in and of itself isn't useful. Actually, as Gary said, we need to be looking at what we actually want the media to look like, what, as people who are interested in radical media, would like it to look like. Campaign for it. Work within campaigns to argue for what we want, and hope that the regulation will somewhat, but any regulation that comes in will some way lead to that, and fight for that. So actually, is to make our views known. The possibilities are there, and I mentioned the Daily Record. Daily Record is what the Sun used to be. In its origins.
You mean the Daily Herald?
Daily Herald. Sorry. Yeah. The Daily Record is a paper they're destroying in Scotland. The Daily Herald is what the Sun used to be. And it started out as a strike sheet 100 years ago. Then it was a paper of the syndicalist movement. Then it was owned by the TUC. Then it became a commercial product that was destroyed by capitalism. And then it was taken over by Murdoch and became the Sun. There is the potential to undo that. But actually what does need to happen is somebody to come in and restrain Murdoch. And the unions aren't allowed in the building. You kick the unions out. We're unfortunately in a situation, the only people who have the power to do it potentially is the government, and it will be through some form of regulation. So I think that's the argument why we actually do need to think about these, because otherwise we'll end up in a situation where radical media can only be bought in places like Houseman's, and that's it. You know, you see the Morning Star probably news agencies, and that's the only national radical newspaper in the UK. Okay, with that, to open it up to questions or comments.
There was talking about the media regulation before the network regulation for a bit. Those sort of questions, they've been sort of knocking about in the press for the last few months. Any answers?
Well, we both gave some. There is actually a coordinated campaign. There's an organisation called the Coordinated Committee for Media Reform, which Martin Moore from Bangkok is on, in the CPBF are in, and it's based at Goldsmith College. And all these different options are being debated. And the one that I mentioned is the one that generally seems to be
The News
Publishing Commission or something like that. I mean, it doesn't, what it's called doesn't matter, but the crucial thing is, the hurdle you've got to get over is the notion of the state participation. That's the problem.
So how would the MPC be set up? And
well, that's what I'm going to go to. You see, the problem with the self-regulation system is it's paid for by the bosses and completely controlled by the bosses. It's just a whitewash operation. I mean, that's not even an exaggeration. That's what it is. And if it is to have sanctions that are going to mean anything to editors, then it has to have some kind of statutory basis. And this is a problem for a lot of people, because you see the owners of the press are going around saying, well, if you have any kind of state participation, then it's state control of the press. And nobody wants state control of the media, obviously. I mean, I often think sometimes if I was tortured on the rack, I was being stretched at full length, and somebody says to me, you're going to die unless you say who you would rather have controlling the press, the government or big business, I would say big business. Because the free press is a possibility that you can work in. We as journalists, you know, it's up to us to organise our union. I mean, journalists, although they don't control the papers, the onus is on us and on supporters and campaigners to improve the press. I mean, bosses aren't going to, are they? All they've got is the profit motive. And this is actually something I should have added. That another element that we want to see is the recognition of what the NUJ calls its conscience clause. That is, that journalists should have a statutory right to refuse unethical instructions. Now, what happens is the kind of things that Tice has mentioned that Richard Peppiatt wrote about on the Daily Star. You should his letter that Tice mentioned. It's on the Guardian website. And he details 4 instances in which he was instructed to write stories that were completely untrue. Now, totally untrue, imaginary, and it happens a lot. It does happen, because if it's a fact, oh, that's a nice idea, let's do that, doesn't matter if it's not true, they're not going to do anything. That's the kind of attitude of editors. Now, journalists, you've got a job. If you're in a newsroom where, like at the Murdoch Press, there's no union to protect you, you really don't have any choice. If you refuse to do it, you're just out of the door. That is the world of the tabloid media. And the way to deal with that is not through regulation of content, although that helps, because it gives people a right to reply, but it's to strengthen the position of the workers in the organisation. And that's the significance of Wapping. You see, there's been no NUJ in Wapping on any Murdoch papers for 25 years. 24, actually. Do you recognise the NUJ a year after Wapping itself? So there is no voice for the workers in the organisation. The journalists, the vast majority of them, hate what they have to do. But if they have a statutory right that they can refuse, they can insist on sticking to the code of practice that Tice mentioned, and say, no, I'm not going to put a white coat on and go to hospital and pretend to be a doctor and take a secret picture of something which is a kind of thing that they do. I'm not going to bribe police officers. I mean, this whole trade, look, phone hacking is far from the worst thing that News of the World and other papers have done. It's not that serious because it's actually legitimised if it's done in the public interest. The Guardian has admitted that it's used phone taps in its investigations, like in British aerospace, the corruption in Saudi Arabia. I mean, they've admitted it, they've used it. There are times when it's justified in what we call the public interest. But what the Murdoch press have done, you know, they bribe police. There's this whole trade of ex-coppers and bent coppers who've got access to people on the police national computer at the DVLA in Swansea and places like that, and they sell information. Somebody gives them a car registration number, 50 quid, they give them the name of the owner of the car. They collaborate with police in setting people up entrapment for fake crimes, like remember the famous Beckham kidnap story, which was completely concocted by the News of the World. They get the innocent guys, they say, let's kidnap Beckham's children. They go, they're from Eastern, they're unemployed Eastern European men. They went outside, they went to case the joint at Beckham's house, Buckingham Palace out in Hertfordshire or somewhere, and it was at 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. Now my God, the police were there. I mean, isn't that amazing? And they got arrested, and the News of the World had its scoop that night, that Saturday night, and they were charged and went to court, and the judge threw it out. There was no evidence. The whole thing was, I mean, those innocent guys could have gone to jail. But much worse things than phone hacking that journalists do. That journalists have to do. So what we need is to strengthen the position. Now actually, this is a bit outside the question of media regulation, because it's a question of employment law. It's the right of workers to elect their unions, because although it's in the 1999 Employment Relations Act, workers do have a right to get a union recognised if they vote a majority for it. What Murdoch did at Wapping is he set up a sweetheart union. The story's in the Wapping Post, called the News International Staff Association, which is a complete front, just like the Press Complaints Commission, paid for entirely by the bosses. Everyone's a member. Nobody pays subscriptions to it, and it's a complete fraud. It's what we call a sweetheart union. But in the law, because that sweetheart union is there, the NUJ can't get recognition. So this is.
Are you only allowed to have one per workplace?
Because there's a union there already.
Right.
Even though it's a fake, and even though the certificating office of a trade union has refused to give it a certificate of independence. There is the procedure for getting rid of it, which you have to do before you can apply for recognition yourself, is very long and complicated. It's all explained in there, I won't go into it now. But this is something else that people should be campaigning for, is the right of journalists to be represented in their newsrooms, and the right of journalists to refuse to work unethically without losing their jobs. That's the crucial thing.
I'd just add, actually, one of the things the NUJ is looking at and campaigning for is even bigger than that, and it is a form of regulation that used to be in place, which is regulation of ownership of the media. We came that close to Murdoch getting full control over Sky, and it was only the hacking scandal that actually stopped that. But actually, regulation.
Well, it wasn't actually. It was the public.
Well,
it was the internet. It was 38 degrees.
Yeah, 38 degrees made it an issue, but I think without the hacking thing, I think that could even possibly have been ignored.
Yeah, but it took a year. It delayed it so long that by that time the Guardian story came out. If it hadn't been to 38 degrees on our VARs and their online campaign, 150,000 people signed a petition, then Murdoch would have owned Sky by then. But
the point I'm making is that ownership is the issue. Not just Murdoch, but NewsQuest, Johnson Press, Northcliffe. Most of the media is owned by very few people and very few organisations. What we really need to do is break that up. Whether we can break it up by actually creating alternative models, looking at where places that have lost newspapers. For example, most of Wales doesn't have a local newspaper anymore. And actually encouraging and supporting people to build the alternatives. And I think this is where it really clicks.
It's quite interesting what you said about Wales, because someone from the Western Mail was at the Leveson Inquiry seminar on Thursday, and they were asked a question about, because they were talking about commercial pressures and decreases in revenue, and he said, well, we've been doing very well for the past 10 years with the decrease in revenue. I cannot believe.
Western Mail is the one that's printed in Bristol, isn't it?
No, that's the Swansea Evening Post.
No, that's they're in Wales. So yeah. So sorry, you just mentioned that, and I just.
And so the two sides of it. One, putting pressure, and in fact the government have said that this is an issue that they're really going to look at, is the question of ownership, which is why I think the Mail immediately introduced a survey of their practices, because the Mail and Northcliffe are part of the same group, and Northcliffe is huge and a massive cash cow. But building alternative models, taking them on, building the equivalent of the Camden New Journal, which is a fantastically independent newspaper, and probably one of the best local newspapers, definitely in London, if not in the country, because it's independent. So building those models as an alternative, and this is, I think, what everyone here who's interested in radical media, I think this is the most practical point. That actually, the more we build the models that can actually connect with the community, can actually create proper local media, whatever platform, the more there's an argument then to actually break up these groups, to take Johnson Press and Newsquest out of the industry, and stop the domination of the media. Because the more they're dominated, the more capitalist they are. And you know, this is the way these groups work. That's just why we're losing journalists all over the place, because massive corporations like Newsquest, which is owned, you know, it's an American-owned company, it cares nothing for local media. And as their profits go down, they cut journalists, quality goes down, so they cut more journalists, and quality goes down more and more and more and more and more.
I was just going to make that point about ownership and say you'll probably get relatively little activist support in some ways for the whole regulation thing, unless you can somehow address the fact that all newspapers probably are mouthpieces for their owners. It just depends whether you like their owners or not, because you don't make money out of running a newspaper these days, so I understand. But I had another thing where I'm involved with Oxford Indie Media, and I don't know if this is completely true, but from what I see, there's a complete disjoint between activist media and, I don't know, kind of mainstream media, call it what you want. And I think I'm convinced there are some sort of really good radical journalists working as paid journalists, but there doesn't seem to be any real connect. And one of the things that came up in a workshop yesterday was someone said it's really interesting when we talk about environmental activism, we talk about like doing a good example but also challenging the bad people, but when we talk about media activism, we talk about going and setting up our own things. So I'm wondering what role you think there might be for activist media to kind of engage and try and shape some of the mainstream media. I don't know if that was a question or not.
Just in response to Tim Cotshill, I think that's very good that, I think journalists should have the right to refuse contents that are untrue. But my predicament as a life science journalist, and I'm sure that Fiona Swabrick, who has been a science editor for Taylor and Francis, would agree that, especially with regards, not so much technology, because I think with the techies we have this mutualist, almost anarchist culture, so you can't really own them. But when it comes to life science, especially agrochemicals and pharmaceuticals, not so much medical device, the news are very much driven by the lobbies. And secondly, the news are also driven by scientific journals and research, which again is backed by, like pharmaceutical companies. So I would say that, but the thing is, because they're very clever people, they tend to sort of like hide the untruth behind a whole stacks of volumes of data and theories, which I've always argued that it's not actually receiving, but actually sticking your head in the sand, you know what I mean? So, but this is the challenge that we have, especially with life science reporting. We know that some of the stuff that we are told to write is definitely not true. In fact, quite detrimental to health. But it's quite hard because they got the editors and publishers in their pockets. So
you've just described the problem of commercial media. I mean, there's a huge medical press. It's one of the few really prosperous areas of the press, of magazines, business magazines, because they're financed by a drug company advertising.
yeah.
And they're just complete. They're just marketing sheets for the pharmaceuticals. That's what they are. Because who pays calls the tune, don't they?
In fact, right, I'm about to tweet on this, but now that you said that, I just realized I just been for an interview as a copywriter, digital copywriter for a medical company. So I was like, damn, I'm going to see this. I'm looking for a job.
Tweet at a Sojourn Posse, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
On the question of how the radical and the mainstream can come together, there are examples of where they do. there's people like Paul Lewis, Paul Mason on Newsnight, Laurie Penny, okay, I'm not sure how mainstream the New Statesman is, but there are examples where they crisscross, particularly in the use of new media tools. And actually those are areas where you can engage. So Paul Mason, when he tweeted after the student riots asking for people to send in their stories. So actually, those are the spaces. They don't necessarily converge on the publication themselves, but there are areas where they can link in and where you can start to work with people and feed them stories. So if you can feed radical stories to the media, you get very strange results. And the strangest result I think I've seen so far, I don't know if Paul Baker was on holidays when the police put out their anarchist hounding thing, but Alarm, the Old London anarchist revolutionary movement, were quoted absolutely straight in the Daily Mail, with a nice long quote putting across their position in defending themselves against the police, with no editing, no change, nothing, absolutely straight quote. In the same week they did a couple of other very odd things. They had an interview with Charlie Gilmore's mother, and that was it. Just a straight interview talking about how bad prison was. So I think actually that the question of availability of activists to the media, too often activists kind of run away from the media and go, it's all bad. A lot of it is. But actually being available, having somebody who can give a quote. I'm on so many anarchist lists where journalists ask, can we have a quote from this, and 3 days later somebody decides whether or not they're going to give it, by which time the story has been long written and gone away. And there are avenues as well. The Guardian's comment is free. You know, just keep banging them with stuff. Keep sending stuff in. You get 85 quid for it. It's not great wages. NUJ has been arguing with them over for years. But I've had 3 pieces published in the past year or so, putting forward a radical trade union point of view. To be honest, particularly from a trade union point of view, well-written pieces actually giving detail on trade union issues. Not just the Guardian, but some other titles are likely to be interested in them simply because they've cut their own capacity to the bone on that. Most coverage of trade unions are vox pops outside a strike, asking the public what they think of it. That's it. You know, anytime there's a rail strike, that's it. It's a vox pop of disgruntled people at a bus stop.
You shouldn't forget letters pages as well. Mainstream media.
Can I just come back on one little thing, just because it did really bug me? Like you mentioned Paul Lewis, I think has done some really good work, but it really, really annoyed me with the Mark Stone Kennedy thing, how long it took him to acknowledge that story broke all the media. I think the first time I've seen him do it was about a month ago. And so I do sometimes think within the activist sort of scene there's a bit like, we didn't really get any credit for that.
Yeah. And that's particularly in the media, that's an issue, and it has been an issue everywhere. There was a story not quite proved, and the aspects of the Irish media were planting stories in the new media so that they could write about them. Do you have another question?
I just didn't understand what you were saying about how if there's more competition, then that'll make the big papers less capitalist.
Not the big papers, but actually in local media.
Local media less capitalist?
There wouldn't be competition. If somebody put together a decent newspaper in large parts of the UK that was at the level of the Camden New Journal, that wouldn't be competition. It would destroy what Johnson Press, NewsQuest, or Northcliffe. They're capitalist at the top level, not at a local level. They're not actually fighting to succeed.
Maybe you need to explain what you mean by capitalist in your understanding.
As multinational corporations are effectively strip mining, these are financial corporations. They're only interested not in the product, but actually in the money they can derive from it. Their current strategy is to cut the product to the bone, so that this material is, in some cases, unreadable. Try and pick up one of the advertiser series in North London and see if that's so actually building up community-connected local media in lots of places would basically wipe out the competition because they're not competing. And they'd also be fundable in different ways, because what's happened is a lot of these companies have centralised their ad sales. So you've got a very small local newspaper that should be connected to the community, and therefore picking up lots of local advertising. So Camden, but go back to Camden New Journal again. Look at the ads in Camden New Journal ads. They're very local, because their ad sales department is in Camden, and they're ringing up local businesses. Whereas NewsQuest, Johnson Press, They have these central, regional ad sales things, which will only take contracts from the Tesco's of the world. So companies that are everywhere. And as a result, they're losing revenue.
They don't even do it that well. They don't even know how to sell the bit that gets them money. How to, yeah, it's just,
So actually, they effectively, what these companies are doing is they're abandoning that sphere completely.
I see what you mean.
So there is a space for alternatives to grow up. And there are so many towns now that don't have a newspaper. And, you know, even Manchester, to build a Manchester-based alternative to the Manchester Evening News would have seemed unthinkable 10 years ago. Manchester Evening News isn't in Manchester anymore. They're now based halfway down the motorway between Manchester and Salford in an industrial estate. And they're not able to cover Manchester anymore.
The river between Manchester and Oldham, they're in Oldham.
They're in Oldham.
Sorry. Well, they're not in Oldham, they're halfway between.
They're on the motor, they're on the M60.
I'm Irish, but you struggle. I'm sorry.
Sorry, anyone else want to speak? I don't want to talk. No, okay, rather. Now I want to pick up on with Gary Herman. That's quite interesting what you say about net neutrality, because just before I left UCL, we did this research on data throttling. And you know that the mobile operators, even the telcos, they are actually trying to throttle data because the pretext is that the consumption of the media is too much, and it was driven by the adoption of smartphone, right? Now this is the thing. Actually, they base that data on the Microsoft research with Microsoft, what they call this experiment on 8 households, and they say that if we hand over the throttling of data to you, these households, instead of the telcos, doing it, right? Would you do it? And we would do it. Actually, if let's say, for example, you see your roommate is like using a quota of the internet broadband, you actually tinker it so that his share will go down and your share will go up, because we have this tendency to sort of like, do things like that. So actually, that's the plan that the not just the broadband people, fixed line, but also telecommunication people are pushing us to. First, they actually introduced this concept that we don't like to throttle the mobile data if you exceed your cap. But then after that, they say that, okay, right now, you don't like us doing it, we'll let you do it. So I'm just telling you that's what they're going to do.
You know that in the FCC rules, mobile operators are specifically excluded.
Yeah, that's the problem as well.
And that's pretty much universal across the net neutrality regulations coming in. There are now 3 countries in the world that have net neutrality regulations, so-called, but Holland, Chile, and Belgium, which doesn't even have a government. So.
But given that journalism is
but if you look at the net neutrality regulations, there, it's just
Who needs government? We're all anarchists.
Don't need it.
There is.
Stuck with it. Then we can get rid of it. That's the problem.
And given that
but
journalism is very
mobile is
mobile,
interesting.
yeah.
Mobile is very interesting.
Yeah, it would be nice to ignore government, but I think when you're in the media and the police have just broken down the door and stolen your server, that's where the problem comes in. There's no proper rules. They have the power.
There's a point about the local, the non-commercial local media, which is there's terrific opportunities for people to run local media because the commercial media is so bad. One of the things that they did, apart from not being able to sell advertising nationally, which is what they tried to do in their groups, was also set up websites. In the 90s, when everybody started setting up websites, the newspaper owners kind of shut their eyes and pretended it wasn't happening, and weren't prepared to put money into it and get really good local websites set up themselves. And when they did set them up, they set them up as group websites for Johnson Press or whichever company it is, with just branded for the group, not for the local community. So that's how they lost all their advertising, because the property advertising went, car advertising and job advertising, the mainstays of local newspapers, all went onto dedicated websites, and nobody is going to go to, if you want to buy a house, you don't look at your local paper website, you look at a property website. So they threw away the opportunity to make money out of the internet. So as a result, they're all in real trouble now, but there are hundreds of local, not profit-making or a little bit of profit-making, local news websites now, replacing newspapers. I mean, it's not difficult or particularly expensive to do. I mean, you've got to compete with the commercial media, but the commercial media is so weak, and the government solution to the closure of local, and the decline of local newspapers is to set up local television stations, which isn't going to work. because no one's going to put money into them. They're going to broadcast for 90 minutes a day. They're not going to be able to raise the advertising to even pay for that. So that, and people, in my view, what people ought to be doing is setting up local news websites.
The net neutrality thing and how to get control of the physical infrastructure, I haven't heard anyone like have a good idea for that. It seems to me like it's the sort of thing that needs to be almost, it needs to be run as a non-profit or a social enterprise or something like that. It needs to be a public utility almost. You don't want anyone able to extract rent from that. Like, I don't know what the economics of running other utilities like electricity are, but you know, all I see is like what other consumers see, just the prices just kept getting racked up, and it's the same with water, same with everything else. So, I mean, do you have any ideas on the best way to run the network?
Oh, we used to have that. We used to have a nationalised telecommunications infrastructure. No, not really. I mean, it's interesting. I recommend that people look at what's going on in the European Commission at the moment. There's a woman in charge of telecommunications policy called Neelie Kroes, who's having ferocious battles with the network operators at the moment, and she's coming up with a lot of interesting schemes for trying to force them to bend to her will. But I mean, without without world government, I don't actually see it happening. To be honest, I was rather encouraged, as I say, when there was this, what appeared to be 10 years ago, this ding-dong battle between the World Trade Organization and the United Nations, but that seems to have faded away now. It's almost as though people have said, well, we don't actually want this global regulatory mechanism. I think that the only way you're going to get it, and the only, is actually, I mean, I dare say, I'm just making this up off the top of my head, is people power, is actually if there's a demand for it, because things are not being made available to people, because they realise that they're not getting, that they're getting bad, even they're getting bad quality, video or whatever it is. The prices are going up out of that. I mean, they will do everything, as you say. We're in a world now where it seems to me that there's kind of a runaway inflation in the provision of utilities, the provision of what used to be public services and used to be controlled public services. And the internet is just a new public service. I think probably the model you've got to think about is how the world actually copes with the provision of basic public services.
It's a more general problem.
Yeah, I do think it is. I mean, I think the net neutrality thing is quite interesting, because if somebody does come in and say, okay, we're going to make we're going to agree that there has to be a global policy towards data transmission, then you've got an in to, I think that's what I was trying to say, you've got a way in to a kind of building up a regulatory system which will actually, hopefully, be able to deliver public service. But in the first instance, it's got to deliver, it's got to deliver a decent bandwidth. It's got to deliver affordable connections, and all that sort of stuff. I mean, you've actually got to start thinking about what it's a way into a broader debate to look at how the technology does what it's supposed to do. I mean, it hasn't been open and neutral for a long time, and there's always been for the last 20, 30 years, traffic management by network operators, which actually says, well, we're going to make this thing go slow and this thing go fast. That exists. There's tiered pricing. So
but it's never been based on the actual content before. It's just more sort of time of day or something. That sort of general traffic shipping.
Yeah, there's traffic shaping based on the type of data. There's what they call deep packet inspection, which actually looks at the data that's going through the network and says, right, that's video, and it gets priority. That's not video. It doesn't get priority.
Well, what you described there, that actually raises the level of service sometimes, because if you increase the
which is why it's a complicated issue. And just to say, oh, net neutrality, that's what we want, I think is not the answer. What you need to say is, what we want from our networks is this. We want to be able to access it, we want it to deliver decent quality of service to people who are connected to it, all that sort of stuff. And then you can start saying, well, and we want this, we want decent content, we want it regulated globally. We want stuff like Red Wax to be banned because it's contrary to the law and it's contrary to decency, And that actually needs a global mechanism to do it, I'm afraid. I can't see any other way you're going to do it. But I think it's a long upward battle.
Well, I think it might be heartening, to know that people are fighting for media, and that we talk about the decline of local media, but there are places that are fighting back. And Ticey was the Mother of Chapel at a strike recently at Becker in South London. I think it might be rather good to hear about that.
Well, it's just what Don was saying about how they're shrinking their operations and, they don't care about their products and all that. And, we have New Square South London has 11 titles and the size of the newsroom is pitiful. It's just so small. And the reason why we went on strike was because, obviously there were lots of reasons, but one of the main reasons was that they decided in our newsroom to get rid of 10 sports and leisure reporters and just redistribute the sports and leisure within to the news sort of teams, and that is just outrageous. Sports, they don't understand it, but they just want to make money. They don't understand the product. We actually I tried back then to come up with ideas and suggestions and ways that they can operate, which maybe they would need a little bit of investment, but they would probably be making some money out of all that. But to get rid of your whole sports team, when sports is probably one of the main reasons why a lot of people pick up local newspapers, local football. It was the same month that AFC Wimbledon was promoted, which they failed to make any money out of that, which was ridiculous. So we went on strike. It was we managed to get pretty much everyone in the newsroom to join the union, which was very good. So we went on strike and we had about 37 people in the picket line for twice. We had 2 days of strike, and then we were going to have 4 days of strike. And we wasn't just a strike, we had a whole campaign, to show people in the communities that those newspapers go to, that the managing director of that company doesn't care. The London managing director, he doesn't care about. He puts himself out there as a local newspaper man, and we completely crushed that image, especially in Sutton where he's from, and he has, does things with the council and everyone knows him, and so we completely crushed that image, and we did it very well, and it was very good. The chapel was great, and everyone worked very hard, and we did it in a way that we left him with no choice but to negotiate with us during the strike. So that was very, very good. Well, I was told it was an achievement. I didn't know that. And we reached an agreement, which we managed to save 3 jobs, kind of, and there were lots of things that we achieved. That all reporters left in the next 6 months or so until the end of the year would be replaced, and lots of other things. We had a long list of demands that they, after a whole day of negotiations, was it a day or 2 days? I can't even remember. It was 2 days of negotiations. Yeah, they were tough days. After 2 days of negotiations, we reached that agreement, and as I told the chapel, because people were obviously, the whole thing, is so disheartening. It makes you unhappy, and it makes you. It doesn't matter what you come out of it with, you're losing anyway, in a way, because they've already, the damage is done with what they're doing with the titles and everything. But as I said, at least we fought, you know, we did what we could with what we had, and we managed to, you know, sort of make that damage, you know, not as bad as it could have been. But yeah, and I think if more chapels sort of organise and get members, get people, it's so important that people join the union in their newsrooms, you know, and have a strong chapel, because if ours weren't strong, we wouldn't have been able to put so much pressure on them.
So you keep saying chapels.
Chapel is what you call sort of your union sort of group within a
Office branch.
Office branch, yes, exactly. So yeah, I mean, if you haven't got a strong sort of chapel, a strong group, then you can't put pressure, and you know, it's yeah, and then they will destroy our local newspapers because they don't care.
That's right.